is now time to enjoy The Fairy Who Didn't Believe in Children with Sarah Kahn.
"Well, I don't believe in children, so there,"
said Tinders, and she stamped her foot on the ground.
"There could not be such ridiculous creatures. Why, some fairies even say that children's big toes are as long as we are."
Tinders wasn't a large fairy herself. She was just a little over an inch tall, and she fitted quite easily into the bell of a snapdragon blossom. Her shoes were the smallest possible size, and her stockings often came down to wrinkle round her thin legs. She had yellow, fair hair, and a dreadful habit of arguing with everyone, even her mother. At bedtime all the other fairies listened to stories about some huge, wonderful creatures called children, but not Tinders. She lay on her side, because that is the easiest way with wings, and often made up stories for herself about dragons and witches and hobgoblins.
"Of course there aren't any real children. They're just make-believe,"
she said to her friends at the fairy kindergarten, which was held every morning under a rather gloomy oak tree.
"Some silly fairies say children are so clever that they can do sums like long division. But everyone knows only our fairy professors possess that secret, and it takes them ages and ages to work it out. Besides, how could children manage to live at all without any wings?"
Tinders flicked her own wings behind her back as she said this, and whisked around the classroom before the fairy teacher came in through the door. Miss Beeswax had filmy, droopy wings and old-fashioned ideas. Oh, she wasn't very clever, and she liked to tell long stories about children's adventures instead of teaching arithmetic and other difficult subjects. Tinders was always a great nuisance to Miss Beeswax, asking questions and such. "But of course we believe in children, dear," the teacher said one day as she prepared to tell a story. "All nice little fairies believe in boys and girls."
"But have you ever seen a child?"
asked Tinders, fidgeting in her seat. It was the top of an acorn cup, and much too high for her. "Well, as a matter of fact, I have never seen a child," said Miss Beeswax. "But that is no reason to assume that children are non-existent. Why, some of our daring fairy explorers have seen boys and girls and have observed their habits. Oh, of course, but they have seldom reported the presence of children in these parts." When talking to Tinders, Miss Beeswax always used the longest word she could think of, hoping that this would keep the obstinate fairy from asking more questions. She went on with her story now about a park in a big city where children played in charge of larger humans called nursemaids. Tinders went on fidgeting, but deep in her heart the little fairy wanted to believe in children, and she suddenly decided to discover a child for herself. And so, when lunchtime came, instead of flying home, she flew straight out of the woods and high in the air over the trees. Oh, yes, it was a lovely day. Tinders flew on and on. Once she met a swallow who was 10 times as large as herself, and she asked him if he had ever seen a child. But the silly bird could not understand a word she said. Again the fairy flew on, and finally, at dusk, she landed in a large garden. Oh, there were flowers everywhere, and best of all, lying on the grass, was a creature who must be a child. Concealing herself behind a bird bath, Tinders looked at the giant-like creature. The child was very long, and yet she did not look grown up. She had fair hair, just like many of the fairies, and sandals on her feet. Tinders could see the child's toes. "It's really true," the fairy said to herself. "Those toes are almost as big as I am." Now Tinders noticed that the child was asleep. Deciding it was safe to go closer, the fairy flew round the bird bath and stared at the little girl's face. It was sunburned and freckled. Tinders thought it was very disagreeable. She flew a little nearer and landed on a button of the child's dress. The button was a shiny mother of pearl, and it made a pleasant seat. But as Tinders sat there, "Achoo!" the girl sneezed. Oh, it was like an earthquake. But the fairy hung on to the button with all her might. "For goodness sakes, don't do that again," she said as soon as she stopped shaking with fright. The child sat up and looked at Tinders. "You're not really there," she said. "You must be part of a dream. Nurse always reads those silly fairy stories to me when I go to bed, and I suppose that's why I'm dreaming about such a ridiculous little creature. Why, fairies are only make-believe. Everyone knows that." Ooh, Tinders had never been so angry in her life. "I'm not make-believe," she replied, bouncing up and down on the button. "I'm just as real as you are, so there." "You're not," said the child. "I am," said Tinders, "and I wish I hadn't have come. You're not a bit clever like the stories say. You're stupid." Well, yes, it was a dreadful argument, and in the end, because she was so tired, Tinders burst into tears. She sobbed, and she had no pocket handkerchief. "A daisy petal would do," she said, sniffing, and as the child began to comfort her, I'm hungry too," the fairy added. "I haven't had anything to eat since breakfast, and I've nowhere to sleep. At home I have a lovely bed with rose-petal sheets." At that moment she stopped speaking and screamed because she saw an enormous figure hurrying down the path. It was the child's nurse. "Well now, Janet, you are a naughty child, leading me to this chase," the nurse declared. "I've been searching all over for you. Please come to supper at once now, and no argument." Well, there was barely time for Tinders to hop into the girl's pocket before the child rose to go with the nurse. In the house, Janet popped the fairy into a flower bowl while Nurse began to set a supper table. "You will be quite safe there," the girl whispered to Tinders. "I'll get you something to eat as soon as I can." Janet had milk and biscuits for supper, and when the nurse wasn't watching, she gave the fairy a thimbleful of milk and a doll's plate of crumbs. After their supper, the nurse came back, and while the fairy lay in the flower bowl giggling, Nurse opened up the nursery windows and said good night to Janet. When the huge grown-up creature had gone away, then the girl fixed a lovely bed for her fairy guest in among some handkerchiefs. Tinders went to sleep at once and dreamed all night long about children. In the morning, after breakfast, Tinders decided that it was time to say goodbye. Janet gave the fairy a grain of brown sugar and half a raisin wrapped to take home. But before Tinders left, Janet showed her all over the house. Tinders was very much excited about the bathroom, with its shower that was like the rain. She liked Janet's own room, too, with its colored pictures of fairies on the walls. Janet showed the fairy her school books then, and Tinders was especially impressed with the arithmetic workbook, with numbers that were nearly as large as the fairy herself, and even some long division problems which Janet had just begun. Janet's papers were somewhat smudged in places, but Tinders admired all of them very much. By this time, Tinders felt that she really must start home. So Janet stood at the bedroom window waving goodbye till the fairy looked like a speck of dust gleaming in the morning sun. Then the child raced downstairs to play outdoors. Back in Fairyland, Tinders still argued with Miss Beeswax and her mother. But she no longer denied the existence of children, and she never again refused to listen to a story about them. And when she grew older, Tinders studied to be a teacher of long division in the fairies' school. After that, she even wrote a school book about children. And to this day, if any clever young fairy tries to tell Tinders that children are only make-believe, she knows exactly what to say to them in reply.